You spelled my name wrong in the Google Doc.
No, I didn't.
Yeah, you did.
I don't have my glasses on. Okay. My bad. I can't see.
Well, Stephanie spelled my name wrong, so apparently it's time to reintroduce myself to her and to all of you, because it's been
what? It's not your name, okay? It's not your real name.
It's my stage name.
Did I put 2 N's?
Yeah.
I always do that.
And 1 C. Terrible.
I'm changing now. Anyways, hello. Welcome back to our loyal listeners. It's been a minute, and welcome to hopefully our new listeners.
Yes, welcome. Shall we take a minute to just recap what's been going on for the new people here at Uneasy Lies a Crown?
Absolutely. So we're sisters, in case
we
that wasn't obvious.
Together.
Make a one big family, though we don't look the same.
We actually do look the same.
Do we?
Oh.
Depends on who you ask.
Anyway,
we're sisters. I'm the eldest, Stephanie, and I am a graduate of the university. I could maybe say my own college, right? The University of Virginia. Double majored in history, and my passion has always been not just in history, but specifically with royals.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm Stephanie. I mean,
you tell it's been a while since we've done this.
Surprise. I'm Stephanie's little sister, Riley. And I too have been obsessed with royals, probably because of Stephanie's influence my whole life. But my academic background is in neuroscience. So I actually just finished my PhD at Johns Hopkins. I'm a doctor.
She's a doctor. Watch out.
And that's kind of why it's one of the reasons why it's been a while, is I was finishing that up. But we started Uneasy Lies a Crown as a blog about 4 years ago during the pandemic. We thought we could combine our history and neuroscience expertise to understand the brains of some known and some pretty unknown royals throughout history, because we're really interested in how mental health, how neurological disease, how the brain can shape, the course of history through our leaders.
And how that history can be shaped and morphed and twisted over time.
Yes.
Or even, during their lives to kind of fit the narrative that was acceptable at the time.
Absolutely.
Do you want to tell the people the other reason why we've been MIA?
Yeah, so Stephanie's lazy is really what it comes down to.
That's not a shock.
No. So in addition to becoming a doctor, I also became a mom.
She's been doing nothing.
I've been lazy. I've been just laying around eating bonbons, as our mother used to say. Yep, so my baby is now approaching 7 months old. So I said, get off the couch. It's time to podcast.
Yeah, when's she coming on? When can we expect her to join?
I have a lot of background literature for her to start with, but
she needs to catch up.
Actually, what's funny is our last episode came out the day that I gave birth, and
that's right.
Due to the fact that I had procrastinated and my husband, our sometimes producer, had procrastinated. There was some audio that he needed to fix on that before we could publish. And I went into labor in the wee hours of the morning. And instead of, going to the hospital when my contractions were 2 minutes apart, I made him edit the podcast and get that up. So that's real commitment, people. Not a lot of people would be
No,
editing their
that's how
podcast
passionate we
during
are.
labor. Yeah.
Yeah, that's how passionate we are, despite the fact that we have been taking a break. But that's only because we wanted to be our best selves and have our best content when we came back. And so far, that is not what we're doing. Literally all over the place. But we are excited to be back, and we're excited to be back with probably a topic that no one knows about, because I know I did
Yes.
not know about our subject in today's.
And we were also, I'll say, I was not the only one booked and busy during our hiatus. Stephanie has been having some adventures as well, and actually had a chance to travel to the homeland of the royal that we are covering today. So we
Yes,
were
that's
feeling
true.
inspired by her trip.
Yes, I did not get a doctorate or have a baby, but I did go to Japan for a Formula One race, and really,
Which is better than what I
I
did.
wasn't going to say it, but yeah, I think that I won that. But anyway, yes, our subject is from Japan. Japan's having a moment, not only because I went there and I deemed it having a moment, but also if you watch TV and you've seen the show Shogun,
I
big
have
winner
not.
at the Emmys. It won a record breaking 18 Emmys. Highly recommend it. I believe it's on FX. But that is about feudal Japan. Very good. And so I think maybe some of that interest in the country and the history has been a result of the success of that show. Yes, they do have a royal family, similar to the British royal family, which we'll talk about in terms of the type of power that they have or don't have. But yeah, so our subject today is Emperor Taisho. And what really fascinated me about Emperor Taisho, other than the fact that he's from Japan, and I've been trying to learn more about this country and I traveled to it, was really because of the actual lack of information I could find about him when I started to do research about him. So, a lot of the other monarchs and leaders that we have covered in our past blogs and podcast episodes have had, libraries, sections of libraries dedicated to them. But in all of my research trying to find out more about Taisho and his life, I could not find one single book that was just dedicated to him. And this man was an emperor. So I was only able to find mentions of him in biographies of his other family members, which is interesting to me because there is a period of time in Japan, in Japanese history, referred to as Taisho democracy. So my thought was there's a period of time named after you, you probably have some content written about you. And that is not the case. And so even in the small amount of research that I was able to find on him, the literature does differ on what, if anything, was wrong with Taisho in terms of his physical and mental health when he stepped aside from public life after becoming emperor. And he was only emperor for 14 years, and most of that he didn't even rule alone. So we want to jump in to Taisho and learn a little bit as much as we can about him, and then we'll talk about maybe what could have been going on in his life and whether that truly did affect his ability to rule. Sound
Love
good?
it. I'm in.
All right, we're back on track. We're going to jump in. So we're going to start with Taisho's father, who was Emperor Meiji. He ascended to the throne in 1867. He was only 15 when he became emperor. In 1868, so a year after he became emperor, revolution breaks out in Japan, and the military is pushed out of the government, where they had held influence and control for many centuries. And I'll talk later more about that structure and the role that the emperor and the military had. But this was also the beginning of Japan's intense distrust of their Western neighbors and foreigners in general, who they saw as encroaching on their land and way of life. And again, we'll talk more about the perception of the West and the changes that happened during Meiji's rule. But kind of the thing to take from this is that Taisho was born into this very changing and evolving world, especially in Japan. And before he was actually the Emperor Taisho, he was born Crown Prince Yoshihito on August 31st, 1879. I'm going to just continue to call him Taisho so that I don't confuse everyone. But that technically wasn't his name until he became emperor when he was an adult.
And he got to like choose his name
Yeah,
as emperor.
exactly.
Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
that was the name he took. So again, I mentioned his father, Emperor Meiji. His birth mother was a woman named Naruko, and she what was called a gon no tenji. And I'm sorry that I butchered that. I didn't learn how to correctly pronounce Japanese when I visited there, unfortunately.
Sloth.
But basically, that term means, for lack of a better word, it means concubine. And Meiji had relationships with several of these women throughout his adult life. But these women were actually very highly regarded in in the empire, in the royal court. They were actually ladies in waiting to Meiji's legal wife, the Empress Shoken.
Okay.
So what's important about that is, if you think back to like Henry VIII, which we've done an episode on, there's a blog. If you haven't listened to it, definitely do. He's the reason why I got into this love affair with royals.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's a lot of talk about his desperation to have a legitimate heir and a son. He did have a son named Henry Fitzroy, but he was illegitimate, so he could not be Henry's heir. He couldn't be future king. Emperor Meiji's wife, Empress Shokin, was actually unable to conceive her own children. And
Oh.
so she actually legally adopted Taisho, which made him legitimate in the eyes of the law. This is a practice that we've seen in other places. We saw that in Caligula's Rome, when emperors commonly did adopt boys who weren't technically blood related, but they adopted them as their legal sons, which gave them the rights of an heir. So this is a practice that was happening in Japan. Unfortunately for Henry, it wasn't happening in England. That would have been nice for him and probably saved us a lot of heartache and saved a lot of women's heads.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, that's a little bit about his background. When he was only 3 weeks old, he contracted cerebral meningitis. Riley's going to talk to you more about meningitis and what that means. Essentially, it's an infection that causes inflammation around the brain and spinal cord. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep.
In a nutshell, again, we'll talk about more. Um, I actually had a friend in college who had this, and
Terrifying.
I remember finding him in a bathtub hallucinating with like an insane fever, and it was terrifying. So I can't even imagine what it was like for a 3-week-old baby in the 19th century to
Yeah.
contract this. Um,
And
and
can I just say
yeah,
that I read in my research that he had what, like 15 siblings, or he was one
yeah,
of 15,
he was one
like
of 15.
Meiji fathered, yeah. And this is like he was not the only one who had health issues because only 11 of them survived. Or sorry, 11 of them died young, so only 4
Yeah,
survived.
yeah. I read
And
4 or 5 only made it to adulthood.
yeah, which is wild. And I don't know, sometimes you're like, okay, maybe that was just normal for the time. So I did like look up the mortality rates for children in Japan at that time, and Meiji's children had twice the mortality rate. So I don't like,
And
clearly
you
a
would think they
lot
had the
of
best
heartache.
care,
Right.
right? Like,
So not great medical care probably, but also uh, even though the mothers were concubines. Like, I think from what I understand, there were still some standards. Like you said, there were ladies in waiting, and some people have suggested that maybe it was some inbreeding stuff. If you want to hear about that, go listen to our episode on the Habsburgs. But yeah, I
You can
just
never
thought
rule that out with the
never,
royal. Never rule it
but
out.
super tragic.
Yeah. And he was also the only boy that survived. So
Ah,
not only was he very sick and he was young, but he was the only boy, I guess at this point, or that eventually survived. So there's a lot riding on young Taisho.
mhm.
And his dad didn't even meet him until he was 2 months old, probably because they weren't sure if he was going to make it.
Wow.
But finally, he seemed to get better, and then the country was able to actually begin celebrating the birth of a male heir, which was really exciting for the time. A person in Taisho's life that he had a really close bond with was his great grandfather, Nakayama Tadayasu. Nailed it. And he actually lived with him, his great grandfather, for a few years when he was young, and then he moved back to the palace with his parents. Significant part of his childhood that happened with his great grandfather. He was visiting at his great grandfather's house, and he developed a severe fever and convulsions, and was really so sick that he couldn't leave that house for a month. And it took him a month to be able to move back to his parents. So again, there's some debate on what happened here. One historian, Donald Keene, suggests that this bout was psychosomatic and was induced by his reluctance to leave the nostalgic warmth of the Nakayama house for the solemnity of the palace.
Okay,
So,
Freud. Relax.
Riley, you may touch on that at some point. Um, Keene is basically saying something about his mental state triggered his physical symptoms. Like, was he
Which,
happier living with his great grandfather and didn't want to go home?
and also just as an aside, if you want to do a deep dive on psychosomatic uh, diseases, listen to our episode on Alexandra Romanov, because we go into that in more detail.
Yep, absolutely. So, not surprisingly, this latest episode caused the royal family to worry that Taisho is not going to live long enough to be emperor. And with given his siblings' history, again, not surprising. So he grew up in sort of a bubble because of his fragile health. And so that meant private tutors. He wasn't around kids his age. He was apparently very spoiled, and did not make life for his teachers easy for his teachers. But again, sounds like a young boy. Around age 8, he was actually finally sent to public school, which was a big deal for the time because this was the first time that a Japanese heir had attended public school. So it was a change in custom. And what was also a change in custom is that Meiji, his father, wanted his son to learn about the West, about their customs, so that he was prepared when he took the throne. And this kind of learning was apparent in Taisho's adult life because he did have a love of the West. He learned to speak French. None of this was popular with older members of the royal family. But again, his father thought this was important to do in light of what he had seen during his rule. When Taisho was 21, he was informed that he was engaged. So he was told, like
Love
many
that.
royals are, which was a big deal because there are a lot of people that thought that he wasn't going to be able to have a family because he had been constantly sick. So I'm happy to report that he showed them wrong. He was engaged to Sadako, who was the daughter of a nobleman, and they quickly welcomed a son named Hirohito. That was their first son, who was healthy and strong. And then they actually had 3 more sons.
Love
So
that.
if we're counting
Redemption.
strength by the ability to have male heirs, it's looking pretty good for Taisho. Again,
Absolutely.
Henry is somewhere very jealous.
In hell.
Yes. Oh, well.
Oh,
Oh.
oh, she's
Yeah, I
upset.
guess so. It wasn't really great in the end, but it might not have been fault. You can listen to the podcast and decide for yourself. Anyway, Taisho finally becomes emperor in 1912 when his father dies. And again, that's when he officially became Emperor Taisho. He takes that name. Um, and then I will talk about kind of the repercussions of his past and his illness and his love of the West. But I want you to kind of dive into his health struggles as a child and what that meant for his later years.
Yes, thank you for teeing me up. As you mentioned, meningitis is a swelling in tissue that surrounds the brain and spinal cord. This diagnosis that we have of cerebral meningitis is like the one solid fact that I feel like everyone can agree on when they talk about Taisho. So
Yes.
I'm going to focus on that. I might have a little information that I can touch on with that second episode at his great grandfather's house. But we're going to go with what we definitely know, which is that he had cerebral meningitis, and then see if that makes sense with any other symptoms or things that people noted later in life. So, first of all, let's talk about the meninges, which are those membranes that get inflamed in meningitis. So there's 3 layers, and they wrap around the brain and the spinal cord. Because Taisho had cerebral meningitis, that means that it was surrounding his brain, not his spinal cord, which can make a little bit
Okay.
of a difference in terms of symptoms. But the meninges are made of 3 layers. The first is called the dura mater or tough mother. I literally hate that name, but
Like
um,
who get like a nickname?
no, that's like dura mater in Latin means tough mother.
Stepmother.
Ugh, gross. But this is actually like probably one of my favorite parts of doing a neuroanatomy lab, is getting to see the meningeal layers, because the dura mater, it like kind of looks like a scalp. It's like a very thick skin,
Mm.
and it houses the sinuses where you have drainage of fluid. So
Oh, I
you can.
know.
Oh yeah, Stephanie, ask her about her sinuses.
Please
Sheesh.
don't.
And then the next is the arachnoid matter, which separates the dura from the cerebrospinal fluid, which is the fluid, I think we talked about this before, that encases the brain and spinal cord.
Step
And
protects it.
yeah, protects it from, we talk about in the King Henry episode, from like hitting the skull,
Jostling. Yeah.
and then also has like some good nutrients and things in it. And then um, the last layer is called the pia mater, which it's super amazing when you look at a human brain where the pia mater hasn't been removed. You actually can't tell that it's there because it's like perfectly formed to the shape of the brain. Like a lot of people call it like a saran wrap or cling wrap
Mhm.
effect, but there are a lot of blood vessels in the pia mater, so it's a source of blood supply for the nervous system. So, in terms of what causes the inflammation of these meninges that we see in meningitis, it's typically an infection. So, anytime you activate an immune response, you get a bunch of immune cells coming in, they start producing chemical signals, and all of this produces inflammation. So, swelling, fever, redness, all of those things. And this could be from a bacteria, a virus, a parasite, a fungus. Today, I'll mostly be talking about data from bacterial meningitis just because it's the easiest to confirm like what the cause is.
Mhm.
But we don't know for sure what caused Taisho's meningitis. It could have been anything. Important to note that there can be like non-infection related cases of meningitis. So sometimes with traumatic brain injuries or with certain types of cancer, you can see that as well.
But
But
we're
we're
ruling those
we're
out based on his age.
yeah, we're gonna assume that it was an
Yeah.
infection because he was a neonate. Um, um, but age does actually play an important part in the symptoms. So, an adult with meningitis, like your friend in college, is going to have different symptoms from a baby. So, when we think about an adult, we think about flu like symptoms, fever, headache, nausea, dizziness, changes to the vision, and then the hallmark that, like, I remember hearing about this sometime, and like still when I'm sick, it's like, oh, do I have a stiff neck? Because if like
Mhm.
I have a stiff neck, then it's meningitis and I
Yeah.
should be concerned. In babies, we're just looking at their behavior. So seizures, irregular breathing, vomiting, and then the big one is trouble eating. And babies are actually pretty susceptible to, or not susceptible, but it's more serious, right? If
Right.
a baby gets meningitis because their immune system is still developing. Um, babies, neonates actually can't make their own antibodies, which are a huge part of your defense against infections. I'm sure everyone is familiar with antibodies after COVID, but basically the body doesn't start making antibodies for several weeks. So at the beginning of a baby's life, they're receiving any antibodies either from the mother in utero or from breast milk. But overall, they're not going to have as big of a repertoire of antibodies to respond to different things. So they are more susceptible to infection. And then something else that I thought about was that, from what I understand, Taisho's birth was pretty traumatic. And actually, I read that his mother was never allowed back in his father's bed after that because
Yeah.
he was so like traumatized by how difficult the birth had been. So in light of that, I was interested if there were any risk factors in terms of birth and how that leads to possible meningitis. And there are associations between meningitis and premature birth and low birth weight. Also, maternal vaginal infections or births where babies have a low oxygen supply for whatever reason because of difficulties. So I do wonder if something kind of happened during the birth that made him more susceptible.
Very possible.
Yeah. I also don't know exactly when he suffered from this cerebral meningitis. Like you said, his dad did meet him for 2 months. So
I think he was like
I'm
3 weeks old.
yeah, I'm guessing it was, in that first kind of month period. So the data that I'm going to talk about is kind of trying to reflect that. So it's like newborns and what we've seen in newborns with meningitis. So, in thinking about whether this case of meningitis could have led to any of his difficulties later in life, there is definitely evidence that meningitis can have long-term consequences. So, data from the UK's National Health Service estimates that between 33 and 50% of people who had bacterial meningitis go on to have lasting symptoms, which is a lot.
That's a lot.
Typical symptoms would be loss of hearing or vision, impaired coordination, and changes in cognition, like decreased attention span or having difficulties with memory.
Okay.
But that's data in adults. When you think about the trauma, the swelling, the just huge immune response in a baby whose brain is just starting to develop, you can imagine that there's longer term consequences. Specifically, we're thinking about if the meninges are inflamed, that kind of puts pressure on the underlying tissue. So that is not good. Obviously, that can cause some changes to brain activity, but also all of those immune cells that are now surrounding the brain are releasing all of these inflammatory signals, which can have effects on the brain itself and can alter, neuronal activity or glial activation, and all of this can have long-term consequences when it's happening at a developmental time point. So there are two papers I want to highlight. One was a 2003 paper. The reason why there's so few that I can talk about today is because meningitis in neonates is thankfully like pretty rare, especially in today's day and age. But they, in this paper, were able to look at 111 different cases from the UK of children who survived bacterial meningitis. All of the children were followed up when they were 9 or 10 years old.
Okay.
So about a decade later. And then they did a bunch of tests to look at their cognitive abilities, their motor skills, and their sensory abilities. And then they compared each child to a child with who never experienced meningitis, who was born at the same hospital at the same time, which
Okay.
is a really good way to control for like a lot of other things that could actually result in differences in
Right.
their tests. So this was a well-designed study. And they found that compared to the children who never had meningitis, those that did had an increased likelihood of seizures.
Mm.
They had more hearing loss. They were more likely to have hydrocephaly, which is when you have too much of that spinal fluid in your brain, so you have swelling. And they had a lower average IQ.
Hmm.
And, this was in 2003, so the medicine is a bit more advanced than in the late 19th century Japan. So
Right.
you can imagine that the outcomes would likely have been more severe for Taisho.
So
And
that
then,
episode that he had at his great grandfather's house, where they described it as convulsions, could have been seizures.
yes, that was what stuck out to me, is that seizures are a pretty common outcome for neonates with meningitis. So that would make sense. However, I do think it's odd that, we only have this one account of
Right.
the seizures. I don't know if it was more severe or maybe it was really the only time, but just something to note. Then there was a second paper in 2011. It was a meta-analysis. So they looked at all studies of neonatal bacterial meningitis cases. And all of these studies, they followed up with patients at least 5 years after infection. And they had pretty similar results. They said that 78% of the kids analyzed had intellectual or behavioral problems when tested 5 or more years after the infection. And this also made me think about Taisho's behavior later in
Mhm.
life. We know
Mhm.
that he had a lot of trouble with his teachers,
Yep.
a lot of acting up. This is a very common occurrence in children who survive meningitis in the neonatal period. So it's tough that we don't have kind of more detail about Taisho's health struggles. But I would say just knowing alone that he had cerebral meningitis as a 1 month old or less, we can
Mhm.
assume that his brain was altered profoundly,
Mhm.
and likely did contribute to some of the behavioral issues that he had. And it could likely also contribute to the health problems as well.
Mhm.
And if it is true that he suffered, this really traumatic birth, that is also another reason that he might have suffered both these um, physical and psychological difficulties.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we'll talk about it here in a second. Kind of the two theories of um, of what happened when Taisho after he became emperor. I do think the birthing aspect is very interesting because it was clear in history about how traumatic it was for his birth mother. But again, like just not a lot of detail,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
something interesting that I have noticed since we're talking about mental health is that whenever I see a new like psychiatrist,
Mm.
they ask about like the context surrounding my birth, if
Oh,
I was vaginal or C-section delivery, and if there was ever a shortage of oxygen, because that is just such a huge risk factor for a lot of psychiatric disorders down the road.
that's fascinating. I've never been
Hmm.
asked that.
Well, I guess I'm just a very special case.
I guess you walk into a room and they're like, "Oh,
They're like, you definitely did not have oxygen during birth. Yeah.
this girl." Fascinating. Well, let's talk a little bit more. I want to talk a little bit more about Japan historically during Taisho's father's rule. So again, we can kind of see how it had changed by the time he became emperor. So in 1867, when Meiji took the throne, Japan was a feudal country, which means that the majority of the population was renting land. They were farmers. and they were working it to earn a living. They were renting it from the wealthy. So, and even though the emperor was technically at the top of this class period, the military actually was the real source of power and control. So again, if you watch Shogun, or if you do watch Shogun, you will see this depiction of feudal Japan. Shoguns were the military leaders, and they were the ones that had the real power because they had the military behind them.
Is Meiji in it?
No, it's Shoguns before.
Gotcha.
I think it's a couple hundred years before.
Oh,
actually. But so again, in 1868, there's revolution in Japan, and the dynamics change. Power is actually restored to the emperor. So great for Meiji. But what it also did, and what happens with a lot of, in the cases of a lot of revolutions, is it opened the door to outside influence, particularly Western influence. And as happens in revolutions, the people that are unhappy are looking to other governments for inspiration. So this led to pressure on Meiji to create a Japanese constitution. And under that constitution, he as emperor was still the center of authority, but he did create some, checks and balances. They created a prime minister. They also created a parliament called the Diet. So when Taisho becomes emperor in 1912, Japan's only less than 50 years post-revolution, which is not a long time when it comes to history in countries. And Japan is also fresh off of a war with Russia. What's interesting is you mentioned the Romanovs earlier. So during this time that Taisho is on the throne, Meiji and Taisho, Tsar Nicholas of the Romanovs is actually the emperor of Russia.
Oh wow, I'd love to see it.
Yeah, so there's kind of some parallels between their rules, which I think are interesting.
I love a crossover episode.
That would be incredible. But if that wasn't enough, if you're tracking the timeline, it's 1912. We're just 2 years before the start of the Great War, or World War I, as we now know it.
Yeah, okay, British Stephanie coming up.
Hey, they didn't know that there was another one coming. So, so it's not just a difficult time in Japan's history, but in the world history as well. So during this time, a country would be looking for a strong and stable leader. And there were a lot of beliefs among the government elites that Taisho was not the strong and stable leader that Japan needed during this time. They thought that he was incompetent, that his health was very poor. And actually, the Admiral Yamamoto, who's a future prime minister, actually was quoted as saying, it was loyal not to obey the emperor's word if we deem it to be disadvantageous, to the state. So not a lot of loyalty with Taisho, unfortunately, when he takes the throne. And so the question here is, was he unpopular because he was too sick and incapable of performing the duties as emperor? Or was there something else going on? So we know that, of course, Taisho struggled with his health as a child. We just talked about that, and perhaps into his teens. But we also know that as an adult, he fathers 4 healthy children. He's often traveling around Japan. He was clearly interested in learning. And so there's no evidence that I found that when he took the throne, he was ill. Doesn't mean that that's not true. It just means that evidence is, I couldn't find it. It wasn't obvious. So the other theory is that the government's lack of enthusiasm and support for Taisho was more political, because I had mentioned earlier that Taisho's father, Meiji, made him be educated about the West, Western history, language, traditions, cultures. This was very unpopular. at that time, and it was still unpopular when Taisho became emperor. So, the winds of change are blowing. People in Japan are demanding expanded rights. They're a couple years from this giant war, and this is when the movement known as Taisho democracy starts coming into play
Mm.
and starts growing strength. So, as we know, for people in power, when you start to challenge their belief systems, they don't like that. What they want is a monarch who is going to put his foot down and keep the status quo. So this is very much like Tsar Nicholas, who again is sitting the throne at the same time, and they both. What's interesting is they both don't really seem to care much for like the pomp and circumstance of the royal life.
Mm-hmm.
So with monarchs, you can go one way, you can get too far into the pomp and circumstance where you're, spending all the money and you're being lazy and you're not doing anything. But you go the other way where you're like, I don't want anything to do with this. I'd rather just be normal. And people also don't like that,
Yeah.
So
Interesting too, the parallels with the two of them in terms of how physical health plays into
yes.
how much trust that people have.
Yes, how you're physically
I guess in
seen.
terms of the Tsar, it was more of his heir, but still.
His heir and his wife.
His wife, yeah.
So they didn't portray this picture of a strong family unit, and neither did Taisho, whether it was because of his past or whether, he still had physical ailments. But there is evidence to suggest that he did have increasingly poor health after he became the emperor. Again, the specifics are unclear, but according to the historian Takeshi, Taisho's physical and mental decline were most likely due not to lingering effects of the illness he experienced as a newborn, but actually because of the strain and demands of his life as emperor. So again, you can imagine just someone who isn't really interested in ruling. I don't know if that he never explicitly said I don't want to rule, but maybe not in the way that he was expected to. That pressure can have a physical and mental effect on you.
Mm-hmm.
And one of his sons actually also claimed at some point that his father was a completely different person once he became emperor, and probably not in a positive way. So either way, whichever side you believe, the reasoning why, the government officials did start to plan for a different future, one that didn't star Taisho, but instead starred his son. And those plans were propelled forward in 1921 when Japan's prime minister was assassinated by a political dissenter. So this is a time for strength. And Taisho's oldest son, Hirohito, who you may know his name, was 19 years old at the time, and he is announced as Japan's regent. The official announcement is that His Majesty's decline of mental faculties seems to be after effects of the brain illness he suffered in childhood. So this is what is presented to the people. So that is the narrative that the government was giving the people.
That's so interesting.
Very specific, because they knew people knew about his health issues as a child, and so they kind of fell back on that.
People in this time period really did not want to see a sickly child thrive.
They really didn't.
Like,
and really, it's not that long ago. Like, this is the late 1800s. This is the Civil War is happening at the same time in America, if you can believe, which again is not that long ago. So this notion of what a leader is at that time, and even today, I feel like we don't really get past it today. There's still debate about what a leader and our presidential debates and who a leader looks like and how we present ourselves to other countries and whether there's strength there. So
yeah, well, I was thinking as you were talking about the kind of public response to him being a sick child of when you learn in history class about FDR, right, like
Mhm,
hiding
mhm.
his illness, you're like, why did he have to do that? But I feel like
Right.
even in this election, you've seen like
Yes.
people do have some valid concerns about physical health, but this desire for a leader whose physical strength matches their
Mhm.
leadership strength is not actually like a an ideal of the past, which I think
No.
it's easy to characterize it as.
Yeah, very much not so. And then for those of you who may be new, and we talk about a regent, so that is someone who um, becomes basically the de facto leader when the monarch is not physically or mentally capable of ruling. And so that is what that's what Japan was saying at this time, is that Taisho was not able to rule, and so his son would do so in his stead.
And
Um,
was Hirohito the regent? Was he the son who said that his father was never the same after
it
becoming
doesn't
emperor?
specify.
Okay.
I don't think so. I think it was one of his other sons.
Yeah.
Um, but what's interesting is Takeshi, the historian, he actually claims that Taisho refused to retire in favor of his son. So that gives some credence to the theory that he may have been forced off of it,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe he was just stubborn. We don't know. But Hirohito remained the regent for Taisho for the next 5 years. And then Taisho passed away on Christmas Day in 1926. Um, and he was actually seriously ill at the time, or so, again, they say. We don't know what it was. But he was young. He was in his 40s. So there's reason to believe that he was actually sick.
Mm.
So it's just fascinating to me because I could find letters and tons of information about monarchs that lived 500 years ago,
Yeah.
but I can't tell you how or why Taisho died in his 40s.
Mm.
I don't have that information, or maybe I don't have access to it, but it's not readily available.
Yeah.
Um, but his son Hirohito, his legacy did make a mark on Japan and in the world. He was emperor of Japan during probably the most significant events in Japanese history. There was the December 7th, 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor, which of course brought the United States into World War II. And it was Hirohito who made the decision to surrender in 1945 to the Allies, following the atomic bombings of two major Japanese cities. So he's still emperor at this time. Once they surrender and after World War II, the monarchy does transform. It becomes more to resemble what we see of the British monarchy now and what we see in most monarchies, which is that it's symbolic and not authoritative.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and Hirohito remains on the throne until 1989. So, again, not
Wow.
that long ago. He was actually the first reigning Japanese monarch to take a foreign trip.
Where'd he
Um,
go?
I think he went to the US.
Oh, he should
Yeah.
have gone somewhere a little bit more glamorous.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure he went to multiple places, but he left Japan,
Okay.
which, like we
He can't
talked
go to
about, was a big
Cabo. Sheesh,
was a
take a
big deal.
vacation.
Yeah, I don't think the world's gonna let him vacation to Cabo after.
It's true. Not a good look. Well, I'm surprised they let him come to the US.
That's true. That's true. Good point.
Definitely was not Hawaii.
Yeah, people have short memories. He was old at that point, but yeah. So I mean, that you can see the difference between when Meiji and even when Taisho was younger about keeping the West out or keeping others out, and then by the 80s, or by the time Hirohito's older, he's out making foreign visits. So
Mm-hmm.
it's just interesting to me that Taisho's father and his son are two of arguably the most notable Japanese monarchs in history, and he's just kind of in the middle as this remembered as this weak and incompetent ruler. Um, but his ascension to the throne does mark critical points in Japanese history. And, we'll unfortunately never know the true reason that he was forced off of the throne. And if the medical issues that he experienced as a baby, as a newborn, plagued him throughout his life, even until he passed away at an early age.
Mm-hmm. And what's ironic about it, too, is that if it really was more of a conspiracy of sorts to get Taisho off the throne because they didn't like his policies, they ended up bringing his son on, who arguably
Right.
went on to meddle more in the West than
Right.
Taisho probably would have dared.
Yeah, exactly. So be careful. It's like, be careful what you wish for. And part of me also thinks, like, if he had really been sick and incapable of ruling, then why hide it?
Mm-hmm.
Like, as opposed to, if he was healthy, they want to kind of hide that evidence to create their own narrative. But again, Japan is a very proud country, a very proud people.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen this with other countries where they, again, want to create that narrative, and they do kind of, cover up maybe or hide some of that history, the historical documents that would shine light on what was really going on. So I can see it either way.
Yeah. I think we did an episode, right, on the Queen Elizabeth's cousins and how their entire existence was covered up because of their disability and their neurological disease. So yeah, that is not an uncommon theme, unfortunately.
No, and countries aren't going to stop covering up stuff or their leaders.
No, absolutely not.
I mean, we still don't know about the UFOs. They won't tell us that.
I'm not getting into this with you.
You're not?
No,
You're too sophisticated now. You have a child. You can't talk about aliens.
No, I'm scared of space, Stephanie.
Oh, that's true. You are scared of space.
I'm terrified of space.
I read the best series ever, and I really want to give it to you, but it's about space, and you'll never sleep again because it totally freaked me out. It's called The Three Body Problem, for anyone who's interested. It's also a Netflix show, but the books are way better. And all I could think about was how I wish that you could handle reading about space.
I can't. Even now thinking about it, I'm holding my breath. And it's
That's
a shame because
Gravity.
I didn't see Gravity, but I love Arrival, and I love what's the
Interstellar.
I love them as concepts, but truly, I can't breathe. And then it also comes a little bit into physics that physics and I never jived. I'm scared of physics. I'm skeptical of physics. And our brother is obsessed with space and physics. This weekend, he said that my daughter is going to become an astrophysicist, which is probably the most rude thing he could have ever said to me.
Don't put that on my baby.
Because how will I relate to her?
Yeah, I'm out on physics. I do love the Big Bang Theory, though, which is an unpopular take.
Such a millennial.
Oh no, my millennial is showing. Well, we're happy to be back. We hope that you enjoyed our return episode, and we promise that we will be much more involved until the next life event that happens.
I promise we should never make them.
Next week we'll have Riley's baby on, and we will have taught her how to read and talk by then, because as a part of this family, she has to be an overachiever. So
she does. She is working on her dissertation, and
lovely.
Yeah, I think there's some really good insights in there.
I can't wait for the presentation.
Very monosyllabic and yet so insightful.
That's a Bannon.
That is a Bannon. Can't even spell it right. Get out of here.